One of the things I mentioned is that it was the American philosopher George Santayana who said that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it.
After graduating from University of Oxford, Montek Singh Ahluwalia began his career at the World Bank in 1968. From there, he went on to serve as an economic advisor to the Ministry of Finance in India, Special Secretary to the Prime Minister, Commerce Secretary, Finance Secretary, and eventually the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission in India in 2004. He was appointed as the first director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF in 2001. After a distinguished career spanning over 3 decades, he retired from the public service in 2014. Montek Singh Ahluwalia is well known for his written work and including his 2020 book, Backstage, the story behind India's high growth years. He has been featured in prominent Indian and international journals. In 2011, he was conferred India's second highest civilian award, the prestigious Padma Vibushan, for his contribution to India's economic reforms and public policy.
Welcome to today's event, which is the Advocata Conversation with Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. This is a regular series where we have discussions with prominent people, including economists. And what we try to do is to understand the story behind the person and him as a person and what his policies have stood for. So let me ask my colleague Sarath to introduce Dr. Ahluwalia.
It is my distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce Montek, who I known for some time. He joined the World Bank much earlier than I did, not much, maybe 7 years earlier. But we have had a very common set of friends over the years. I can rattle off the names that you recognize, from Sujit Balla to Shankaracharya, not in a particular order, who worked in the bank and went back to India. And like I think you led that group. We have a lot of people who were there. I can say Bimal Jalan before you, I guess. Suman Berry, Shankaracharya, Rakesh Mohan, Sujit Balla, Sarwa Latif. They gave a good value to the country by going back and using their experience as you also did working on other countries. So it's a very good connection. Unfortunately, we don't have many people who come to Sri Lanka, back to Sri Lanka, and offer their services. So I think you did very interesting leading the group. And I have a little thing, I'm going to say a few things about it, that your career was your youngest division chief in the World Bank. You had left your reputation as a person who worked on, earliest person to work on income distribution and growth. And you had the book with Hollis Shettery. It's a well-known book. People still keep looking at it because those issues have become very to the center now, as they were not in the center at that time when you were working on it. And then you have the people who you deliver for them, people like Jagdish Bhagawati, Arvind Panagiriya, T.N. Srinivasan talked about the potential for India. You actually allow them to realize it. That I see it that way, that what Jagdish and them said, a miracle to happen at least during that period, and I think it has now continued for 30 years. So I have a later question, how is it going to pan out in the future? How these reforms are going to be continued, or are they going to sink? So without much ado, I can say I will, when we finish it, about to finish it, I'll have a couple of questions for you after reading the book. I enjoy the book. It's very easy to read, all the 450 pages, very simple language, clear. You feel that you are participating what you are doing. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much, Montek.
Thank you, Sarath.
Right.
Thank you for that introduction. You did write this book, Backstage. Before we delve into that, what made you write this book?
Well, let me first begin by thanking you for inviting me to Advocata, and also thanking Sarath for this very warm introduction. We really do have a shared experience with lots and lots of friends, and it was nice to see all their names mentioned. And thank you also, both of you, for giving prominence to the book. And, if I may resort to a little bit of advertising, let me just hold the book up.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what it looks like. And I have no idea how easy it is to get. I suppose it must be there in Amazon. But, one of the things the pandemic has done has to pretty much shut down the habit of going into bookstores. Hopefully that'll come back. But anyway, I do hope that those of your readers who are stimulated by the discussion will also go and buy the book. Now, let me turn to your question. What made me write the book? Well, I had a very busy life in government. I should add, by the way, that everybody's life in government is busy, whether they're doing anything worthwhile or not. Because one of the arts of government is to make everybody senior think that they're very involved in everything and fill their day. So if you're in government in a senior position, even if you're doing not very much, your day is full. People, there are cabinet meetings to go to, people want to drop in on you, etc. So I had not done much thinking during my last 10 years, if you like, in government, other than in trying to make an impact internally on policy. And that is always something which doesn't enable you to put out stuff in public. I mean, you speak. But, when you're speaking, you're by definition defending government policy, even if you yourself have some reservations about something. So I thought it was a good idea, after I'd finished my government stint, to put down my perspectives without the constraint of being a civil servant. And my wife, my late wife, Isha Ahluwalia, very strongly urged me to do that. And so, I took a little bit of time thinking about it, and then decided, yes, I would write a book. And she was very helpful also in reminding me that, the book shouldn't read like the economic survey or the 5-year plan, both of which I had a lot to do with in government at different times. It ought to read pleasantly so that a person who's not an economist by profession can actually read it and get a sense of what the issues were and what the positions were. I also wanted, since I wasn't actually the principal, I wasn't the prime minister or something, I wanted to write a book that would be a little bit objective. You can never be objective about a process where you are involved. But I wrote it not as a autobiography. In fact, in the introduction, I explicitly say that I got put off the idea of writing memoirs because I read something in the New York Times which said that memoirs are selfies in book form. And I didn't want to write something just focusing on myself. But on the other hand, I have been through what I think is a very interesting journey for anyone interested in India, and maybe also for anyone interested in the evolution of development economics, a journey of how policies got made, and in the Indian case particularly, how much they changed. But they didn't change very much in the first year, they changed a little bit. But after 1991 reforms, they changed quite dramatically. And I think it was worth telling that story. That's what made me write it.
Thank you. So if I can ask you, can you tell us a little bit about your early life and your education?
Well, my early life is the life of a typical middle class, not upper middle class, but middle class person. Brought up in an environment in which the family firmly believes in upward mobility for their children, but also believes that the upward mobility is only going to come through academic achievement. I mean, the family was not prosperous. I wasn't going to inherit anything, and all they could give me was values and give me a decent education, which they did. So, I mean, a typical middle class bringing up, emphasizing the importance of doing well in school, maybe too much emphasis on the importance of doing well in school, because competitive examinations, etc., were the way to get ahead. Very early in life, my parents worked out that, I really didn't want to go into science, because the usual thing was become an engineer or something. And I really didn't want to go into the Indian civil service either, the Indian administrative service. I wanted to be an economist. And, they kind of felt, well, okay, you can take economics, but then it's sensible to join the Indian administrative service. Then I was lucky that I got the Rhodes Scholarship, which took me to Oxford. And, once I reached there, I think my parents realized that I had got myself to a level where I knew more about what the options were than they did. So they just wished me well and took pride in whatever success I had, and more or less let me do whatever I wanted. And I had a great time in Oxford. I did an undergraduate degree with senior status, and then followed it up with what is now called an MPhil, and then got a job in the World Bank, which was expanding rapidly at that time.
Whilst you were in Oxford, you also happened to be the president of the Oxford Union.
Yeah.
And in 1966, incidentally, two illustrious Sri Lankans, Lalitha Tulamudali and Lakshman Kadragaman, were also presidents of the Oxford Union about a decade before that. Sadly, they were both assassinated by the LTTE. And the second Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, SWRT Bandaranaike, was also a secretary of the Oxford Union in the 1920s. So you write in the book that the real problem with debating in Delhi was that it did not really hone the art of persuading people to change their minds or even rethink their position. It certainly taught us the art of public speaking. Later in life, when faced with the challenges of having to persuade senior people in government to change their way of thinking on economic policies, I realized the art of persuasion is very different from the art of debating and much more challenging. So tell us how your debating skills helped you in your career and how you mastered the art of persuasion.
That's a tough and philosophically difficult question. I've been recently counseling my grandson on this. And, in reading about it, I came across the fact that in the ancient Indian tradition, there are many different kinds of discourses that are talked about at length. It ranges from Samvada at one end, through Vada, through Jalpa, through Vitanda. Now, Samvada is really kind of when a superior being imparts knowledge to an inferior being who readily absorbs it. I mean, the best example of that is in the Gita, where Lord Krishna is telling Arjuna about truth in the universe. It's not an exchange between equals, but it's a gaining of knowledge. The next kind of discussion is Vada. And Vada is very interesting because Vada is discussion amongst equals, but it's not just amongst equals. It's amongst equals who understand each other's point of view and constrain themselves to use only logical arguments in order to argue against the other side. I mean, you're not allowed to use vituperative arguments or make fun of the other side or something. And actually, if you go into it, one of the criteria for having a Vada-type discussion is that each person should be able to explain the other person's point of view, with which he may not agree, but explain the other person's point of view and rationale in a manner which the other person would accept, saying, yes, that is my point of view. That's really a mutual search for knowledge with agreed rules. Then you have Jalpa, where each person has his own view. And his main purpose is to push that view and refute the other. And you can use any number of ways of refuting the other. And the last one is Vitanda, which is you don't really have a view. You're just heaping abuse at the other person. And you can use any number of arguments again. Now, if you look at real life, far too much of public discussion has become Vitanda. Yeah. That's what you get in SMSs, people just being rude about each other and so on. So really the name of the game is somewhere between Vada and Jalpa. Now, debating is a little bit like Jalpa, actually, because you stand on one side, you stand for that side, you kind of argue against the other. The only element of persuasion is that there's a vote at the end and somebody wins. Now, as a general rule, if you resort to pure Vitanda, you're not likely to win the argument. The audience, unless they happen to be your own buddies, will not actually be very impressed. But argument can be fair or argument can be clever, and that kind of, both of them work in the Jalpa framework. What we had in India was really just making a speech. You didn't persuade anybody except the judges. And the judges were much older, and they judged you by the quality of your English, the accent, and things like that. A little bit whether you had some kind of academic inclination. And I didn't think that was very interesting. The Oxford Union was more interesting because in the end there was a vote. And so, there was no such thing as a brilliant speech and then you lose the vote. Because if it's a brilliant speech and you lose the vote, you haven't really gained anything. And that was new. But I think even that kind of debating, because it allows you to use whatever arguments you want against the other side, is not very satisfying. I mean, really the most intellectually satisfying kind of exchange is what in the Indian tradition would be called Vada. Yeah. Equals, using logical argument, that's really what a discussion should be. If I were running a university or running a university course, amongst my students, I would want to promote a lot more Vada and a lot less of the other things. And certainly for teachers, a lot less Samvad. You don't want the teacher to pretend that the teacher is in the position of Lord Krishna lecturing Arjuna. That's no use either. So it's a kind of a convoluted answer to your question. But I've always felt that the nice thing about debating was that there was a search for truth going on. And that was not there in the kind of debates we did in Delhi University.
Okay, thank you. Then you talk about your life partner, and I quote from the book, "There were many reasons why I stayed longer in Washington, D.C. than the 3 years or so I had originally intended. The most important was Isha, who I first met in 1970. She arrived in Washington, D.C. from MIT for a summer assignment with the IMF. She was pursuing her PhD in economics and had just completed her coursework. Her classmate Brendan Horton, an English student who knew me from Oxford, telephoned me to say there was a really nice Indian girl spending the summer at the fund, as it was popularly known, and that I should get in touch with her. I promptly followed up. I took her out a few times and was soon convinced that Isha and I had found a life partner. She also was a distinguished economist. How was it to have such a person as a life partner?
Well, wonderful because of the person. We didn't do too much discussion on economics. The fact that she was an economist meant that she understood the work I was doing. She was also a researcher, so she would occasionally ask me for my views. But she was very suspicious of people working in government, including me. She knew that deep down, we're always trying to put across the government position because that's what we are paid to do. But I think that we we used each other as a foil, but most of our interactions were person to person and not really as economists. We never wrote a joint paper together. We never did any joint economic research together, although she was also working on the reforms needed in economic policy and in the 1980s. And I think in that process, I did interact with her quite a bit and maybe put across my point of view. I think she was herself inclined in the same direction, so it was a good exchange. But that was not the dominant factor in our partnership. Actually, she stayed clear of government, wanted to work in the research world because she felt that it was very important for the concerned people and stakeholders to be better informed about economic policy. And governments, while they try to do that, they always have an angle. And she wanted that there should be an independent research body looking at this. And I fully agreed with that. I should mention, by the way, that she was a great believer in the need for interaction amongst developing countries on economic policy, and particularly greater integration of research in South Asia. I mean, she was aware of the fact that all our research institutions kind of look to America, Harvard, or Oxford, or Cambridge, or what have you. And she was visiting Colombo, as it turned out, on some World Bank sponsored conference on economic reforms, when Joe Stiglitz, the chief economist of the World Bank, was there. And she said to Joe that, look, there's all very good research that you have sponsored, and you're paying various South Asian researchers to do research. But you know, if you really want to stimulate research in South Asia, you should fund a body of South Asian research institutions which can do research on their own problems, rather than have World Bank funded research. And I think they came up with a very interesting idea that Joe Stiglitz accepted this, and they set up the South Asian Conference for International Research. I forget the exact name that was used. I think it was, anyway, I'll get back to that if I can find the exact name. But the idea was that there were member institutions in South Asia, basically India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Nepal. And what would happen is that they would do once a year a conference where they would bring in people from these institutions working on problems in their own countries, and then sort of share the stuff and have it published as a conference volume. And they got T.N. Srinivasan as a sort of academic mentor of this group. Then they went one step further and they said, look, we should fund research outfits, research projects in which, let's say, an Indian researcher and a Bangladeshi researcher collaborate to work on the same subject. In other words, whether it's trade policy reforms or water reforms or electricity in India and Bangladesh, or India and Sri Lanka. And that also worked quite well. So I think she was very concerned that you needed a research community beyond the government, and indeed, ideally, in all of South Asia, because frankly, we are very similar, in a way, cultural as well as historical types of economic problems. And I feel that while she did succeed in setting up this institution, it later on got taken up by multinational governmental sort of participation, and therefore the total independence of the research institutions was somewhat compromised. But I think we need a lot more of that.
Sarath, did you have any interaction with this forum?
No, I have not had, because I have not lived here for a long time. But I know that Montek was a member. I think you were, once we met, you had come on something for that thing, and with Madam Kumar Dunga. I think
Yes, but that, I was invited in my personal capacity
Yeah.
to give a lecture,
Yeah.
and that was great.
Yeah.
But I think what Isha was talking about is institutional linkages
Yeah.
between research institutions with a conference once a year. I mean, for example, I know that in water, my wife was also on the board of IVMI, which is based in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of the work being done in that context is very relevant to the Indian context, and equally the work being done in the Indian context in Tamil Nadu actually would be quite relevant for Sri Lanka. Because after all, they're sort of the same ecology and the same kind of geographical situation, etc., etc. I just think we need a lot more of that, and we're not aware of it.
Yeah.
I mean, most people, if you ask them, they are aware of what is happening because of World Bank publications. But Isha's point and my point also is that, while the World Bank plays a very important role in collecting information and homogenizing the result so that you can read it in a simple way, it doesn't have the same impact. When I was deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, one of the things that everybody was concerned about is whether we should move away from this subsidized distribution of subsidized food grain to a conditional cash transfer. Now, that's been a big subject in Latin America. The Mexicans did it very well. The Brazilians have done very well. But in India, there's such a vested interest developed behind the subsidized distribution of food grain, including amongst NGOs, who actually like the government doing this kind of thing because they can then monitor what's happening. Is the public distribution system shop functioning well? They're not at all happy with converting this into a cash transfer. And yet, given the changes that have occurred in information technology and our unique identity card and the universal banking and what have you, it has now become very easy to take everybody who has a public distribution system card and simply give them a cash transfer. Now, I argued this with many politicians, and I said, look, the assumption that they need to be given wheat. I mean, the first thing is that you're only giving them half of the wheat they need. You're giving it at a huge subsidy, fair enough, but you're only giving them half. So they have to go to the market anyway. So you have to believe that there is a market where if you have the money, you can buy the wheat. So why not give them the subsidy in cash? Yeah. And you may well find that they may not want to buy more wheat. I mean, if given the same subsidy in cash, people may prefer to buy coarse grains, which are cheaper and also healthier, by the way, and use the extra to buy vegetables, which they need. But huge resistance. Now, what I did was I asked the World Bank, they had written hundreds of papers on the subject, but I asked the World Bank to finance the guy who made the change in Mexico to come and give us a lecture. And this person came and we arranged a meeting, and it was very interesting. The number of people who turned up to hear this guy was vastly greater than would have turned up to hear the World Bank expert on the subject telling us about what's going on in Mexico and what's going on in Brazil. Because, people wanted to ask an actual practitioner, how did you get people to change their mind? They want to know what his interaction was with his own public, with his newspapers, with his own minister. Did some ministers agree and others not? And how did he handle it and so forth? So I think that there is the World Bank plays a very useful role, I think, in making people familiar with the broad themes of research, but it's absolutely no substitute for direct contact. Now, what is happening is globally, of course, the pandemic has changed all that, but what is happening globally is there are innumerable conferences. They're all set in Europe or in nice places with good climates and so forth. And they invite people from different countries. But when an Indian goes to whatever it is, Cambridge in Massachusetts to attend a conference, and there's also a Sri Lankan there, both of them have the instinct that they must go and talk to the famous professors from Cambridge or Stanford. They don't have the instinct of talking to each other and finding out, hey, what the hell is going on in your country? Whereas if we were to do this kind of interaction amongst ourselves, we would learn much, much more from each other. And I just think that Isha's effort did have some success. It hasn't actually gained adequate momentum. The pandemic, of course, has made it virtually impossible. But I mean, that will change. And I just hope that we do have more interaction. I don't believe, by the way, that a research institution can be really respected if it isn't seen to be influential beyond its own country. I mean, just imagine to yourself that if there's a research institution in India which could say that, look, we've been doing this work, and you know the government of Sri Lanka has responded very positively, and here's what they've done. I mean, that would raise their stature in India hugely. Much more than if they were to say, you know, I wrote this paper and it's been published in the Journal of Development Economics. I mean, you know, that's okay if you want a job in the university, but it's not really going to make much difference in the policy world.
Dr. Ahluwalia, you touched on a very important subject on cash transfers, which is something that I wanted to explore further. So, Microeconomics Theory 101 teaches you that consumers have preferences and they have a budget constraint, and depending on that, they decide what they want to consume. Now, the economics is very clear that it is better to do cash transfers instead of doing subsidies through prices, because it messes up the allocative efficiency in the economy. What is the current status on subsidies in India? Has it been completely transformed into a cash transfer system? Or you talk about the fair price shops and a smart card that is being used?
Yeah, I think our hope was that, when I say our hope, my hope was that we would join the global and switch from direct subsidies to cash transfers. Now, there are 2 or 3 areas where this would be relevant. Area number 1 is actually food subsidy, where at present you can buy hugely subsidized wheat and rice, and what you get is half of what you would normally at your income level consume, but you get it at 10% of what might be the market price, or even lower. Okay, I have long held the view that we should just convert this into a cash subsidy and just give it to the person through a bank electronic transfer, and rely on the person concerned to buy whatever they want. I mean, if they simply want to replicate the present situation, they would be able to do so. On the other hand, take a small farmer who actually can grow his own wheat or grow his own rice, small farmer. He may actually prefer, rather than, in order to benefit from free wheat, he has to reduce the amount of wheat or rice he grows, because he knows that he's going to get very cheap rice from the PDS, the public distribution system. On the other hand, if he got a cash transfer, and if he found growing rice is the easiest for self-consumption, he would use all his efforts at growing rice and use the money to buy milk and vegetables and cheese and so forth. Now, NGOs are totally opposed to this because they think that the money will be taken by the men and used on drink. I mean, the old British Victorian prejudice that if you give money to the poor, they just drink themselves silly. Ample evidence to suggest that while men do want to drink, they won't actually take away food subsidy transfers to spend it on drink. And in any case, wherever there's a senior woman in the household, the transfer can be directly to her account. Doesn't have to be to the man at all. But unfortunately, it's one of those things that, there's always going to be some little problem with a change which you don't know about. And the opposition is usually raised that this is a plot to switch you to cash transfers, and then they'll freeze the transfer, although prices will rise. Lack of trust, whether the government is really going to do what it says it's going to do. And we've not succeeded. What we have succeeded, things like pensions, which were in any case cash transfers, but you had to go and get a check from a person and so on. And, that can always be made an occasion for bribing. Otherwise, they don't give you the check. Those things are now transferred directly. Similarly, scholarships are transferred directly. They're not mediated through some office where you collect a check. But food subsidy, fertilizer subsidy, and also electricity subsidy, that is not yet transferred directly to the individual. And I personally think, as you said, microeconomics 101 would suggest that we should do it. And there have been some very interesting studies by an NGO called SEVA, which is actually a very progressive sort of NGO in India, based in Gujarat. And they have, at their own expense, they've collected money for this purpose. They've gone to small villages and they've rolled up people to volunteer that, look, you surrender your ration card to us, so you won't be able to get the subsidy through the PDS, and we'll give you an equivalent cash. And it's interesting that before the experiment, women were very opposed to it. But after the experiment, the attitude changed, and they all felt, yeah, this is better than having to go to the public distribution system. The biggest reason why it's better is that at present, when you go to the public distribution system, you have to go to a designated shop. So basically, that guy is a monopoly supplier of subsidized food for you. And if he's shutting the shop at 5 o'clock and you just came at 5:05, he'll just say, go away and come back tomorrow. Quite apart from the fact that he'll cheat and give you adulterated wheat and this, that, and the other. If you have money in your pocket, the guy will be running after you saying, come, I've got a nice new wheat stock, etc., and so on. So, it's a no-brainer in my view that we should do it. And it's one of the great puzzles why we haven't done it. We haven't done it.
Can I? Yeah.
Yes.
Montek, we tried to imitate what you were doing with Niti Aayog. We sent one of our brighter parliamentarians to go and look at it. And the whole idea was to go to a cash system, having that system in place. But as you said, our people all objected to that for various reasons.
No, we're the same people, so
Right.
Dr. Ahluwalia, while you were in the World Bank, you were one of the major contributors to a document which became the orthodoxy of the bank called Redistribution with Growth.
Yeah, that's the one I read.
What was the essence of the message from that document?
Well, it's always good to look back 30 years, not more than 30 years.
Than,
Redistribution with Growth is 50 years ago. I think the central message of that document was that the poor are very poor, and no development strategy makes sense if you aren't going to be able to say to people that, look, your condition of living is going to improve. It's not enough to say we're going to have 6% growth, but I don't know whether your income is going to grow or not. Maybe the growth will all be somewhere else. That's not good enough. So you need that. But B, that higher growth is essential when you have a very large number of poor, because redistribution alone cannot achieve the objective. If you're rich enough that you only have 10% of the population is poor, you don't have to restructure your overall economic strategy in order to look after the 10%. You just provide a special support mechanism for them, either some income support, or health support, education support, etc., etc. When you have 40% of the population and more poor, there's no way that you can solve their problem through redistribution, so you have to have growth. But the growth should be of a kind that filters down and doesn't sort of stick to the top. I used to work for a while for Prime Minister V.P. Singh in India. This was in 1990. And he was actually a poet in his own right. And he once said to me, he was very fond of this phrase. He says, Montek, We need the kind of growth that falls like rain on the mountain and trickles down.
That's so
Not the kind of growth that falls like snow and stays on the peak.
right. Very nice. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the term trickle down became a negative term, whereas in my view, it should be actually a positive term, because trickle down just means gentle rain trickling down. The question is, does it trickle down? If your real picture is that there's huge rainfall and only a trickle is coming down, that's bad.
Yeah.
But otherwise, the idea that income flows because of the gravitational pull is a good idea, and you don't have to go and raise income of everybody by intervening at micro points. I mean, this was the critical thing. And in redistribution with growth, we worried over the question of what do you do about small farmers? And there we came to the conclusion that, look, small farmers, you cannot rely only on trickle down. You have to increase the productivity of the land they work on. So you need a direct attack on rural poverty. But I don't think the same thing is true in urban areas. I mean, if a lot of people are engaged in low productivity urban jobs, you don't want a similar effort to improve the productivity of people engaged in jobs which actually shouldn't exist at all. And what you should be doing is stimulating growth which generates employment so they get out of these jobs and move into higher grade jobs. So I think redistribution with growth really meant to say that, look, don't think that redistribution is going to solve the problem. Worry about growth, but make sure that the growth is of the kind that benefits some of the critical sectors where the poor also live, mainly in rural areas. That was, and plus, I think it also had the sense that the way to benefit from growth is to have better education. If you don't have good education, you're not going to benefit from growth. And I think these were all ideas that got picked up at different times in the World Bank and then pushed. Now, mind you, I think in redistribution with growth, Hollis Chenery, who was the vice president, senior vice president who masterminded this, actually acknowledged that these ideas were borrowed from a paper produced in the Indian Planning Commission in 1962, saying perspectives for living up to 1960, which actually said that, look, the name of the game in planning must be to bring everybody above some poverty line. Now, what I think that document, and they also had a concept of 40% are poor, below the poverty line, etc. And Hollis said that, look, that's the first document in a developing country that explicitly builds in poverty into the plan. The problem with that document was that it totally failed to acknowledge that the solution did, and by the way, that document said it's not good enough to aim at 5% growth and not achieve it. India should be aiming at 7%. But the solution, how to achieve the 7% growth, it never said we need to rethink economic policy. It remained public sector driven, raising public sector investment, etc., etc., etc. Redistribution good tried to move away from that preoccupation. And I mean, that is really what later on came to be done in the economic reforms. Now, I should mention, by the way, that the origin of this was McNamara. McNamara is the one who brought the whole small farmer and driving home the extent of poverty in the public debate in the West. Now, his motivation dominantly was that, this was done in the early 70s or so. His motivation dominantly was that in the West, there was a kind of disillusionment with aid that was taking place. And he felt that the way to get people in the West to focus on the importance of assisting developing countries is to change the focus from just helping developing countries, which many of these Western observers would say are dominated by leaders who are appropriating all the gains, etc., and there's corruption and so on. And to say, look, the World Bank will make sure that this money gets to the bottom So his motivation was not just to help the poor. It was also a perception that this is the only way he could rationalize the continuation of World Bank. Because at that time, there were many people saying that foreign aid is useless and doesn't have any effect whatsoever.
So, Dr. Ahluwalia, I would like to get into the India reform story, but can you let us know what the prevailing ideology was at the time? And you mentioned in the book about the Fabian socialist ideology that had influenced the Indian National Congress. What exactly do the Fabians stand for? And you came back to India in 1978, and there was this lackluster growth for many years, the Hindu rate of growth, etc. So what was the prevailing ideology? What influenced it?
Yeah, critics used to attribute the government of India's excessive emphasis on control to a Fabian ideology. Though, in my view, that's a little unfair to the Fabians. The Fabians were actually social democrats. I don't think any Fabian ever said that you should have the ridiculous types of controls that we had in India. I mean, the continuation of those controls is partly due to the fact that during the war, the British had introduced all kinds of controls on the grounds that, look, the war effort is most important. So it doesn't matter what else happens, let's make sure that the war effort is suitably supported. And they did the same thing in their own country, and the US did it also, that everything was directed to the war effort and the government intervened. Now, of course, these countries after the war dismantled all this and went back to the market. So unfortunately, we didn't dismantle it, partly because we tended to view development as a war on poverty. So the development effort was equated, in a way, with the war effort. A lot of the controls were actually not due to Fabians, but due to the influence of Russian thinking. The so-called Mahalanobis model, which guided a lot of Indian development policy, it gave a lot of emphasis to capital goods production, is simply another variant of the Feldman model that governed Soviet policy at the time of Stalin. That everything needs to go into capital goods. In a way, you extract surplus out of the poor peasant and make sure that the workers are adequately fed, and you produce an industrial machine. Now, the Russians were incredibly successful in managing a war effort, and in fact, the defeat of Germany is not due to, contrary to what our war movies tell us, is not due to the Americans or the British. It's really due to the fact that Hitler made the absurd mistake of attacking the Soviets, and the Soviets drove them back. And they drove them back having mobilized a huge amount of industrial strength to produce more planes and even better planes, and certainly more tanks. And some of the tanks were also better. Now, this became totally unworkable by the time peace broke out, because then, you have to cater to a multiplicity of wants. But I think for the Indian policymakers, the Soviet Union was a phenomenal example of a country that converted itself from a feudal type of country. I mean, nobody took Russia seriously in the West, to one of the big three, sitting with Churchill and Roosevelt in Yalta. And people said, well, look, that's really the way to industrialize. Well, the short answer is it wasn't. And I mean, the Russians realized that, the East Europeans realized that. So basically, Indian policy, in my view, was excessively influenced by Soviet communist type of intervention without state control of the means of production. So the typical Indian sort of effort that we're not going to nationalize industries, but we're going to watch these private sector guys carefully and control them. I mean, that's the worst of all worlds. And not surprisingly, we didn't do very well in the growth stakes. And that's what caused the change beginning in the 1980s.
So for the benefit of some of our listeners, can you give us some kind of an illustration of what the license Raj looked like?
Well, it's an absolute horror. And so let me give you, that's a good, in many of the things I'm writing, right now is the 30th anniversary of the 1991 reforms.
Yeah.
So I've been speaking a lot and writing a lot and so on. And one of the things I mentioned is that it was the American philosopher George Santayana who said that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah.
Now, considering that 1991 was 30 years ago, and nobody who was under the age of 15 would remember what the economic situation and economic policy was like, I think it would be fair to say that today almost 60%, if not more, of the population in this country has no idea what the ridiculous policies were. So let me just list. One, they were based on the assumption that the public sector must occupy the commanding heights of the economy. This is, again, a typical Soviet-influenced notion. If some sectors are very important for development, they must be run by the public sector. Even if there are private sector guys able to produce in this very important sector, they won't be allowed to do so. I mean, the ones that existed before were allowed to continue, but they were not really allowed to expand, and new fellows weren't allowed to come in. And one of the sectors reserved was steel, for example. And the Tatars produced steel in 1920s, and steel stuff exported from India was used to build the Sydney Harbour Bridge. But for some reason, independent India decided that we can't allow the Tatars to expand. A ridiculous decision, right? So you reserve lots of areas for the public sector. That's point number one. Where the private sector is allowed to expand, you only allow expansion subject to an investment license. So industrial licensing was brought in. And industrial licensing was much tighter if you were a large company. So if you were a large company in India, there's not a hope of your becoming globally large, because people would say, no, you are becoming, you're becoming a threat, a monopolistic threat. Again, a ridiculous idea, because if you combine that with openness to competition, you're not a threat. Just keep imports of steel free with modest duty, and then let whoever it is run the steel industry compete with import. But we didn't do that. We preferred to keep domestic, new, fresh competition out and put lots of controls on imports. And those controls on imports were both in the form of high duty and also in the form of import licensing. For example, consumer goods imports were completely banned. In my view, it's one of the most ridiculous decisions we made, which actually prevented integration with our neighbors in South Asia. After all, the Indian market, we're still a poor country, and although many Indians will tell you we're a large market, we're a larger market than our neighbors, but we're not a large market globally. However, if the Indian market for consumer goods, by which I mean garments and other things, were open to South Asian neighbors, they would have benefited enormously, and the integration with India would have been much greater than there has been. But we didn't allow any imports of consumer goods at all. Other imports were all subject to licenses, and a producer had to justify whether he needed to get an import or not. Now, I have a nice story in the book about how Maruti, which is one of our leading automotive producers, a Japanese company, originally joint venture, now totally Japanese owned, they wanted to start producing a small car, 800cc car, and they wanted to import machine tools in order to shape the engines, forge the engines of the new car. And of course, the local guys said, no, we can't give you an import license for that, because Hindustan Machine Tools can do the same thing for you. And the proof that they said was Hindustan Machine Tools claims that they are producing the sort of whatever the engine block is for a scooter, for Bajaj and so on. So, they can do the same thing for a car. It's only a little bigger. And, the chap who ran Maruti tried very hard to explain to them that, look, it's much easier to produce an engine block for a two-wheeler than it is a four-wheeler. Much more complex piece of engineering. And because Hindustan Machine Tools was a public sector company, they had strong sort of lobbying capacity within the licensing system. Of course, Maruti was at that time also a public sector company, so they also had lobbying capacity. The argument went all the way up to the industry minister. And the managing director of Maruti told me that, you know, he had to actually bring into the minister's room an engine block for the Maruti and an engine block for the scooter and put them next to each other on his table or on a special table they erected so that the minister could see that just because you could produce this thing doesn't mean you can produce this other thing. And finally, because Maruti was public sector and because Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was strongly behind the Maruti effort, they got the license to import machine tools from Japan. If they'd been a private sector company, they would not. And what the manager told me was, look, the quality of the engine block needed to achieve high quality performance is crucial. And if they had not been able to get these machine tools from Japan, they would not have produced a good product. So I think the bureaucrats presiding over decisions to import bound to compromise the quality of production because the decisions were taken by people who were largely ignorant. I mean, even if they were engineers, they just sat in their desks in the ministry. They're not actually got any practice working out in a factory. So I think it was clearly an absurd system. Foreign direct investment was not allowed, completely banned in consumer goods and not allowed elsewhere except up to a maximum of 40% equity. Now, you know, foreigners interested in India were interested in the consumer goods market. The Indian market for non-consumer goods was actually quite small. So to say you're not allowed in consumer goods reduces the interest of foreign investors completely. And it prevents the development of an industry which could have become export competitive in due course. The only reason Maruti was brought in as a Japanese investment is because for some reason cars were not classed as consumer goods, they were classed as passenger vehicles. And that became a capital. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been allowed in at all. So frankly, and of course, I mean, foreign exchange, if you went abroad, it was strictly controlled, which also meant that even for a public sector guy, happened to be in New York, if he met a colleague who said, listen, this is a very interesting idea. Why don't you come to my office in New York before going back to India? And let's discuss this further. He wouldn't have been able to change his schedule without getting permission from the Reserve Bank because the places you visited had to be identified in advance. I mean, frankly, it was an absurd system. And I'm really glad that we managed to get rid of it. I think we took too long. What we achieved in 30 years, we should have done in 15. I mean, I'm not a believer in big bang reforms, you know, sort of do everything in 2 years or 3 years or so. But definitely what took 30 years in India should have been done in 15.
You also say the story about Maruti and the Japanese expatriates, that since you banned consumer goods, they couldn't buy their foodstuff. So they had to be periodically given leave to go to Bangkok to buy them and come back.
No, absolutely. I mean, frankly, if you visited India before the 1991 reforms, I mean, the queues in customs were huge because every Indian going abroad was bringing some bloody consumer good back. And, you know, a television set or an oven or this, that, and the other. And I think, I mean, it was another world. And today, I mean, Indians today happily buy through Amazon whatever they want. They pay a duty on it because Amazon cannot import it without a duty. But the thing is there. And therefore, Indian producers constantly aware of the product quality that they have to compete with. And that was missing in the early days. We also made the ridiculous mistake of reserving a very large number of items for production in the small scale sector in the belief that that would create more employment. And in the process, reserved a number of items that have high export potential, including garments, electronics, toys, etc. I mean, these are things that should have been produced just like China did. Get into it, and if you succeed, expand rapidly. Industrial licensing didn't allow that. And the other thing in India was labor laws. Nobody wanted to expand their labor force just because a market had been created, and because handling labor had become very difficult, because you couldn't retrench labor, the strength of the unions, etc., etc. So people preferred to go into capital-intensive industries rather than labor-intensive industries.
So before we get into the crisis in 1991, you also worked with Rajiv Gandhi. And you quote from the book, there was, however, one important difference between the two. VP Singh was much more naturally suspicious of businessmen. I wondered whether this reflected the feudal landed elite's traditional disdain of those engaged in trade and commerce, or that he simply shared Adam Smith's much-quoted view that businessmen seldom meet together even for merriment. But the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. Rajiv Gandhi was more trusting. He believed government needed to work with industry to take country forward. In 1985, he broke with the past practice and took a group of industrialists with him when he went to Moscow on his first official visit. The initiative was widely hailed by business groups as heralding a new style in government-industry interaction. It is a sad note that Rajiv Gandhi could not come back for a second term, that he was assassinated by an LTT suicide bomber. What was Rajiv Gandhi's vision for India?
Well, I worked in his office for 5 years, and I think he laid out his vision at the beginning very clearly. I mean, look, he was not a professional politician. He came in from the professional classes. He was actually a trained commercial pilot flying for Indian Airlines. And he was actually training to move from propeller-driven aircraft to jet aircraft. So he was very aware of the fact that you needed to upgrade technology, etc. And when he first stepped into his mother's shoes after she was assassinated, he made a speech where he said, we must prepare India for the 21st century. He then went off and won a huge election in December of 1989. In December of 1984. And in early 1985, took off in January, first couple of days, took office as the new prime minister. And a month later, speaking in parliament, he said that India cannot hope to be competitive if we are working with systems that are 20 years out of date. So he clearly knew that the system needed to change. One of the things that he wanted change was this attitude towards business. I mean, he firmly believed that government should work with business and not view them with suspicion from a distance. And as a matter of fact, he was the first prime minister to take along with him a business delegation when he went abroad. And this was a nightmare for our Indian embassies, because the business delegations were meant to be integrated into not the official talks, but the social functions. But the embassy didn't really know what was the protocol. I mean, how high were they to be ranked? As a result, they would always list the business guys at the bottom of the official protocol ranking. I mean, this had the ridiculous effect that when the other side organized a big dinner, some of our leading industrialists were seated so far down compared to some of our middle-level bureaucrats. Whereas I would have thought that, let's say, the industry minister of the country that we are visiting would much rather talk to a Ratan Tata or a Narayan Murthy or something like that, rather than to some middle-level bureaucrat who, in any case, isn't going to say anything more than what is declared government policy. So, there were problems. The embassies didn't know how to handle it. But Rajiv did want to bring business in a much more substantive way. And I think at various times he told us that, he got much more in interacting with businessmen than he did interacting with the government bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy was essentially projecting the future as a continuation of the past. Whereas the businessmen were very aware that the world is changing and we need to be able to meet the requirements of those changes, and what is the policy that will enable them to do that. So I think he wanted to do this, but he wasn't able to. I mean, look, he ran into problems in the very first 2 years with the Bofors scandal and managing politics. He didn't have that much experience in politics. And to run a complex political system, you need a lot of knowledge of politics. I make the comparison with Deng Xiaoping. I mean, he was, of course, he made the biggest difference to economic development of any person in the world. Yeah. But we have to remember that Deng had been in the Communist Party for 30 years. He'd been thrown out and then brought back. And then when he came back, he worked hard over 10 years in order to change the thinking of the Communist Party from within, by weeding out people who didn't agree with him, putting others in place. And he did all this without once publicly denigrating Mao Zedong, although he was actually the man who essentially dismantled the Mao Zedong legacy. Yeah. Now, Rajiv Gandhi in 2 years had been greatly hampered by the Bofors scandal and all the other political things that needed to be done. And I've no doubt that if he had got re-elected in 1989, he would have had much more experience. And he said in the year immediately after stepping down, one of our very distinguished journalists, two of them actually, Veer Sanghvi and Sarkar, spoke to him and asked, why were you not able to make all the changes you wanted to make? And he said that, a lack of experience is one reason. Now, I think that was from a former prime minister to admit that was quite a major recognition. But I think it was important. And had he come back in 1989, I think he would have been able to be more effective. But as it turned out, in 1991, in different circumstances, many of the changes that I think he should have made did get made. And that's what the 1991 reforms were all about.
Dr. Ahluwalia, I mean, you touched on the reforms in 1991, and that was the catalyst on that was the balance of payment crisis. And then you came up with this M document, which kind of outlined the way forward, how to reform the system. Can you give us some appreciation of how the balance of payment crisis came about and what your M document talked about?
Well, yeah, I mean, that I will preface my remarks by saying that since you're talking about something I did, I'm not necessarily the most unbiased observer, but having got that, let me just say what happened. See, I think during Rajiv Gandhi's time, we had a build-up of government expenditure. The fiscal deficit was getting larger, and this was reflected in the balance of payments. So typically, excess demands go into the balance of payments. And, this was brought to Rajiv Gandhi's notice. But an election was coming, and it was very clear that, look, we got to do something. But it was decided that, look, let the elections of 1989 be over, and then we'll fix both the fiscal side and the balance of payments. One of the problems was that whereas the Reserve Bank was very clear that the fiscal deficit is leading to a balance of payments deficit, I think intellectually the finance ministry also realized it, but the finance ministry was easily persuaded that we can manage the fiscal deficit, high fiscal deficit, and bring the balance of payments under control by imposing tighter import controls. I mean, this has been the bane of Indian thinking.
That's what we are doing.
My view is that they felt they were complacent on that front. Not that you can't do it, but you do it. If you do it, you put more you inflict a lot more damage to the economy, because it's much better to devalue the currency than to start doing this kind of import protection and so on. And this is the crux of the argument. And I think what happened was that by the time when the election happened, I mean, Rajiv Gandhi didn't win the election. I mean, he had the largest single party, but being a decent person, he didn't manipulate with other parties to get a majority. He sort of said, look, people want a change, so we're going to sit in opposition. And VP Singh came in. That government was a mixed bag of different parties. We had many tensions within the system. He introduced reservations for the backward caste that led to other tensions. And in August of 1990, the Kuwait War broke out when Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait.
Yeah.
And obviously prices shot up.
Yeah.
Now, India was fiscally weak at that point and experiencing a widening balance of payments deficit. With the shooting up of oil prices, the balance of payments really looked quite unmanageable. And with domestic instability, and the VP Singh government didn't really look as if it was going to survive, you had a capital outflow. We'd been relying on NRIs bringing in money. They're smart guys, so when they saw things were getting into difficulty, they started taking it out. And banks stopped giving new loans, so the balance of payments began to be troubled. If VP Singh had a huge majority or a solid majority, he would have realized that, look, I better take corrective steps. But he was in a weak position, and he just resigned. In November of 1989, he resigned. November of 1990, he resigned. And his place was taken by Mr. Chandrasekhar, who had a small group of supporters and was supported by the Congress party from the outside. Again, not a strong government, and certainly not an environment in which you can take strong decisions. Because within the Congress party, people felt that, look, if this government is going to take strong decisions, we're going to be blamed for it, although we're not in government. So about 6 months were wasted, and the Chandrasekhar government fell in March or so of 1991. Now, by then, capital outflows had taken place, the foreign exchange reserves had run down. Rajiv Gandhi tragically got assassinated, so he wasn't there when the Congress was in a position to come back. The Congress did come back with Mr. Narasimha Rao, who brought in Dr. Manmohan Singh as finance minister. They faced an impossible situation. I mean, they faced a situation where foreign exchange reserves had really run down. I think at that time we had about 1 month's imports worth of foreign exchange reserves. Foreign confidence had collapsed. Capital was flowing out. We needed to do something. Well, they went to the IMF. They did a whole slew of measures. But I think in addition to managing the crisis, they also introduced a whole lot of economic reforms. Now, you mentioned the document that I had done in 1990. And I was asked by VP, I was working on it for Rajiv Gandhi, hoping that we would give it to him when he came back. And as it happened, I was visiting, as part of VP Singh's team, I was visiting Malaysia. And VP Singh said, Malaysia has done incredibly well. And I used to come here as deputy minister in 1973, and it's become unrecognizable in the next 17 years. And I said, I used to visit also from the World Bank, and it has become unrecognizable. And he asked me, why is that so? And I said, that's because they've done a lot of reforms and we haven't. So he asked me to write it up, and I said, well, I'll do that. And so I dug out this paper that I was going to give to Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, sent it to VP Singh. And what that paper said really was that, listen, we've got to wake up and smell the coffee. I mean, the world is changing. During the 1980s, the East European countries, towards the end of that period, given up communism. The Berlin Wall had collapsed. Reforms were taking place. They were going whole hog to the market economy. most of the developing countries during the 1980s moved away from the public sector-led development process to something which gave much more freedom to the private sector. China, under Deng, had begun to make tremendous changes and also opened up and integrated with the world economy, and India should do the same. That was point number one. Point number two was that if you want to do that, you need to make a coordinated change in policies. I had this discussion with VP Singh, who asked me that, look, do we have to go to the IMF? And at that time, I said, look, you don't necessarily have to go to the IMF if you're willing to take even tougher action than what the IMF would want.
Yeah.
Because what the IMF will let you do is it will give you a little more money so that you can stave off adjustment for 2 months, 2 years.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to say, I don't want to go to the IMF, then you don't have those 2 years.
Yeah.
So you have to collapse all your adjustment up front.
Yeah.
And if you're willing to take tougher action, you can avoid going to the IMF. Now, of course, the danger in going to the IMF is that those poor fellows very rarely advise all that needs to be done. They get satisfied with a little bit of reforms because they've been badly hurt by what happened in East Asia, where they tried deep reforms, they didn't actually get it right. So, in effect, the reason you should have your own M document is whatever you do, you should be able to say, we're not doing it because of the IMF, we're doing it because we ourselves felt, or one of our research institutions felt, this is the way to go.
Dr. Ahluwalia, Sri Lanka has had quite a lot of interaction with the Chinese. They are playing a significant development and investment role in Sri Lanka. In your book also, you talk about some of your interactions with the Chinese, starting with the meeting in Bangkok. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and your subsequent interactions with the Chinese?
Well, yes, I can do that. I was always interested in what the Chinese were doing because I was aware that, they were adopting this policy of remaining a communist country. But unlike the East Europeans and the Soviet Union of yesteryear, which just actually demolished communism and then liberalized the economy, the Chinese said, look, we're not in any case demolishing the communist system. We want to remain a one-party state, but we're going to become economically efficient, open up to the world, etc., etc. And Deng Xiaoping actually achieved a tremendous transformation in China. And I think today everybody recognizes that the Chinese growth rate has been truly remarkable. In the 1980s, I didn't realize how much the Chinese were consulting people outside. And the World Bank organized a meeting in Bangkok of 5 or 6 countries, including South Korea. And the Chinese were going to discuss whatever they're doing with these countries. And it's interesting because, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi deputed Manmohan Singh, who was then the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, to attend the meeting. And I was meant to be the other Indian representative, sort of assisting Dr. Singh. And the Chinese gave their account of what they wanted to do, and we commented. And, Dr. Singh made the comment that, aren't you worried that this is going to lead to a lot of inequality in China? And the Chinese representative, I remember, and I think I've mentioned this in the book, he said, yes, it will lead to inequality, but we have too much equality in China. So a little bit of inequality. It was a very frank acknowledgement that, we're changing track. And yes, it will have some consequences, but we think we can manage that. And I mean, they were right. They were able to manage it at that time. The more interesting point is that I was later told by the World Bank people who organized it, that actually the Chinese were primarily interested in interacting with the Koreans.
Yeah.
They didn't actually want the World Bank to organize a bilateral discussion with the Koreans. But they wanted them to invite the Koreans to this meeting of 5 or 6 countries. So we were really add-ons, if you like. And the Chinese used that occasion to have more in-depth talks with the Koreans on what they could learn from how Korea had managed the reforms, because Korea was clearly a demonstrable success story in penetrating world markets. And I think I also mentioned in Backstage, and this is taken from Fogel's book, Deng Xiaoping, that the Chinese were very aware that they're making these changes. Now, unlike India, they don't have an open democratic system. So they had a great possibility that they could discuss things in closed doors, knowing that it wouldn't get out into the public sphere and become a political issue. They organized a river cruise, very elite-sounding thing, on some cruise vessel called the Bashang Lung or something, up the Yangtze, in which they had a lot of Western economists and Janos Kornai and Tobin and others. I forget the exact names, but there are quite a lot of them. And the whole idea was to discuss how should China liberalize. And one of the big issues was there were many people in China who thought that we should learn from the Hungarians, because they have gone to some kind of a mixed system. Whereas actually the Americans persuaded them that this mixed system is neither here nor there. If you're going to liberalize, just liberalize and use macroeconomics to control the economy. And they were impressed by that, and they finally did that. The only difference between the Chinese and the Americans firmly believed that if you created a private sector, market-oriented, macroeconomic managed economy, it would automatically create pressures to become democratic. And therefore, we don't have to lecture the Chinese that we don't like one-party rule, because the economic choices they're making will automatically push them in the direction of greater democracy. And that did not happen. I mean, throughout, whether you look at Deng or you look at his successors or you look at the present Chinese leadership, they've all asserted the primacy of the Communist Party. And so the notion that if you liberalize and allow the Chinese economy to integrate with the world, they'll become more like us, which is what the West always assumed. But it's simply not. And that has caused a lot of the rethinking in the West. The lack of comfort in dealing with a system which they think is benefiting from openness and globalization and so on, but is remaining politically closed.
I went to Beijing in 1988 to discuss the World Development Report that I headed. And the man who chaired it was the first representative in the bank board from China. He said, "Don't hold anything back, Sarath. Tell them as it is. We can take it." So I found the most attentive audience, 6 hours with the translations and everything. 6 hours of talk with them. And they were they wanted to know how to do it, what have the others done, what is the report of value to them. You know, it was a very interesting interchange with them.
Absolutely. I think this has been the common assessment of many people that, the notion that China is a kind of an autocratic state that doesn't allow differences to surface is not actually true. They do a lot of internal thinking and a lot of internal evaluation options, just not done in the public. So the vast Chinese population is not aware of it. But within the Communist Party, in select groups, this is discussed. In a way, this makes it possible for them to discuss all kinds of options without worrying whether the opposition will embarrass them in the political arena. You know, my wife was very fond of this aphorism, because she said that China can discuss these things freely, In India, we feel afraid to discuss them because it will have political repercussions. Okay? And so she said this has made China a closed society with an open mind,
Right.
whereas India is an open society with a closed mind.
Right.
And I think that's actually
True.
very true in the
Yeah.
sense, I think our leaders have to recognize that while they can say this is what we are doing and then defend it, they should also recognize that we have to look at all the options. And the fact that we are discussing these options is not an indication that something is wrong or that somebody is putting too much influence on us, etc., etc. Now, how to do that is an issue. I mean, in the West, they have many institutional ways of doing it. And one of the institutional ways is the multiplicity of think tanks. I mean, there's always, in the United States, there are right-wing think tanks, there are left-wing think tanks. We don't have that kind of institutional basis. So as a result, the World Bank and the IMF play too large a role. I mean, let's put it this way. At any given time, they are in a position to field the best qualified people to focus on any country, whether it's India or Sri Lanka. But the point is, the country never says that as a result, we're getting the opinions of the best possible people for two reasons. One is that the World Bank and the IMF, they filter these opinions and give you those of the best people with whom they agree. Whereas if you had think tanks, you'd be able to say, well, look, I mean, some people say this and some people say this, and this is what I've decided. Whereas IMF, World Bank give you a pre-digested meal, sort of pre-cooked meal,
Right.
balanced, and say, look, tuck in and enjoy yourself. And that's not, I think, that's not the way discussions should go. And we need to find ways of overcoming that. And one of the ways is having a much more active community of research institutions, which is familiar with what other countries are doing.
Dr. Ahluwalia, you finished the book on a very optimistic tone for India, that it does have an issue with the current slowdown, but you're optimistic of the future. India is perhaps 60 times larger in population than Sri Lanka and significantly larger in terms of economic size. What is your advice to Sri Lanka of how it can better integrate into the Indian growth story?
Clearly, as you say, there's a large market next to you. I think we have a free trade agreement with Sri Lanka. It was negotiated with lots and lots of difficulties on both sides. But to my mind, I would do the following. Number one, however small a country, macroeconomic stability is a precondition. I mean, you have to live within the resources you've got. So if your tax ratios are too low, you've got to raise them. If your investment rate is too low, you've got to raise the investment. You should encourage as much as possible domestic investment, but you should be open to foreign investment. And foreign investment in this case includes Indian investment. Obviously, you would be greatly helped by an open market next to you. And one of the big differences, thanks to the economic reforms in India, is that the consumer market in India is now open. So you can hope to tap the consumer market in India because we don't restrict consumer goods imports. We do have duties, which may be a little too high, but still, you're competing with other Indian producers. A small country cannot possibly follow, I don't know if I'm saying this, which is contrary to current policy in India, but a small country cannot follow a closed economy model. In fact, the Chinese experience tells you that even a large country shouldn't follow a closed economy model.
Thank you, Dr. Ahluwalia, for this engaging conversation. And I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book, Backstage. We hope that this will kind of motivate and incentivize some of our listeners to go ahead and read your book. I got a copy from Amazon India, but I'm sure that we can incentivize some of the bookshops in Sri Lanka to carry a few copies of your book. And of course, it's available on Kindle, and I'm sure a lot of our readers also read on Kindle. So it's just a click away. We wish you all the best for the future. And before we started, you were mentioning about a second version of the book where the epilogue will be further elaborated, and you want to write another book. Looking forward, we look forward to reading it whenever it is ready. And we will take up your offer that in whatever way you can, you would like to engage in helping us in Sri Lanka.
Well, I thank you very much. Well, many thanks for inviting me. Thank you for putting a copy of the book so prominently in front of you.
Right.
Although I know that nowadays people read in Kindle, it's always nice to see a book physically there. And yes, I will update the book and let you know as soon as that's done. And be very happy to engage in Zoom on other interactions and give you comments whenever you want.
That'd be great. That'd be great.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
once again, and please stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much.
Right.